All right. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight, joining us here in Dearborn Library. We're here with Ms. Lindsay Hiltunen. She's here to talk about the Copper County strike in the Calumet area in 1913. It's definitely an important event in Michigan history, and definitely more so, we wanted to get the background to the Great Michigan Read book, The Woman of Copper County. We're going to be hosting the author of that book next Friday at 11 a.m., Miss Mary Doria Russell, for a Zoom. And if you're comfortable, you can join us in the library auditorium. So we thought it'd be great to get a background on exactly what happened, so we can have a great appreciation of it more. So what I do is gonna send it to Lindsay, and she'll take it from here. So thank you very much for joining us, Lindsay.
Thank you so much for having me. I will ask if you wouldn't mind, for those that are Zooming in, please mute, and then we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. And I'll just give you a little warning. I do have 2 dogs and a very vocal cat, but they're down in the romper room downstairs right now, so hopefully they won't cause too much of a disturbance. So as Dan said, my name is Lindsay Hiltunen. I'm the University Archivist at Michigan Technological University in Houghton, Michigan. And I'm also a PhD student in the Rhetoric, Theory, and Culture program. My background is in library science with a focus on archives, rare books, and special collections. And I also have a secondary master's degree in US labor history. I wrote my thesis on the history of the strike, but I approached it in a way that perhaps is a little atypical compared to how most secondary literature has treated the subject thus far. I was writing it right around the time of the centennial of the strike when I was wrapping up my thesis work. So I participated very actively in the centennial commemoration that was happening in the Copper Country. I was the administrator of one of the blogs that was related to the strike and had an association with the archives and the Centennial Planning Group. I also participated in some panel discussions and then commemoration on the ground at some of the sites. So things related to, like laying flowers at certain areas, giving talks in the community on the fly. And so my approach to this topic is maybe a little bit different than things that you've heard before, but I'll start off just a little roadmap. I'll give you some information about where I work, because we do hold a lot of records that pertain to the strike. And then we'll talk a little bit about setting the stage for strike, like the context within which these events are unfolding. And then we'll have a quick view of some of the things and the major milestones in the strike, but especially the Italian Hall disaster. And then we'll close up with some concepts of the long memory of the strike, ways that it's been commemorated not only in our historical memory, but also in popular culture. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and for having me. So the first piece that I'd like to mention, just making an Indigenous lens statement. Michigan Technological University is located within Ojibwa homelands, and where I live actually on Kuna Bay is right in the heart of that. These lands, homelands, were in ceded territory established by the Treaty of 1842, and you can see the various Native American nations that fall within these homelands areas that Michigan Tech is living or resides within and is adjacent to. We just like to make this claim as a diversity statement. As a student of history, we need to acknowledge the things that happened in the past. And I think for us, as a way to move forward and to really tell a holistic story, we have to acknowledge where we are to tell these stories. So I think it's important that we start to do this more in our daily academic and personal lives. So at Michigan Tech Archives, I've been working there since 2014. I did intern there briefly in the summer of 2013 while the strike centennial was gearing up. And then I finished my grad work, and then I came back as an archivist in May of 2014. We're predominantly a local history archive, although we do collect the history of the university as well. I would say it's roughly an 80-20 split, 80% of our collections relating to the Copper Country region and the Western Upper Peninsula more generally. We collect all aspects of local history. Just to give you a for instance, in our vertical file, which is our newspaper clippings file, we have over 5,000 subject areas that we collect for. Well, that might have been my cat. And yeah, so we have a lot of materials that we collect for. And then in addition, we have a lot of format types. So things related to industrial heritage, so flat files and mining maps, schematics, things like that. We have corporate records for a lot of the major mining companies that were up here. Social history, prominent people and places, business. We have city directories. So if you're doing genealogy for someone that lived up here, there's just a wide variety of things that you can find. Our patron base is very diverse. It spans the globe, in fact. It's not atypical for me to field a reference question for somebody from Calumet, from Milwaukee, and from Finland all in the same day. So we're very geographically remote in the state of Michigan, but that doesn't mean we're not busy and we're not robust. We see roughly 3,500 reference requests and patrons per year. And the average research visit for the on-site patrons is well over 2 hours. So we're a very active little archive with a staff of 4. Little bit about our collections beyond some of the physical collections. We do have a pretty substantial digital archive, and we are branching more into digital initiatives as we move forward. Our current major asset is the Copper Country Historical Images database. A lot of the images that I pulled for this program are actually freely available on that website. You can reach out to me at the end, and I do have a link to it on my final slide. But we have over 11,000 images of the local area, and there are quite a few things related to the strike, Italian Hall strike parades, things that were happening around the turn of the century in terms of the industrial extraction. So a lot of really interesting photos that directly relate to the strike, but also tangentially things that were happening in the community around the time of the strike as well. We're currently working on digitizing over 40,000 mine employee records as part of a grant that we received from the Council on Library and Information Resources. And these will hopefully be available in 2023. We actually just completed the scanning process with a team of almost a dozen student assistants and a digitization specialist that was leading that charge. And those are going to be a rich resource that will be available on the library website at Michigan Tech, and then also at the CUNA Time Traveler website, which is a geospatial index that's available online from the Social Sciences Department at Michigan Tech. If you have any questions about that, you can reach out to me. And then we are also moving more into the realm of active oral history. We had a few that we've conducted as part of grant projects. I have a forthcoming project coming on the centennial of Michigan Tech hockey, which happened last year, but we couldn't do the oral history because of the pandemic. So we are looking at, we're reaching out to former and current athletes, fans, coaches, anyone interested in Michigan Tech hockey. That will be our next oral history initiative. So when it comes to the strike itself, we are one of the premier facilities that has material related to the strike. The strike was national news, so I mean, you are going to find things in newspapers across the country that are residing in repositories across the country. And of course, you'll find things at the Bentley, you'll find things at the Library of Congress, you'll find things at the Clark. But in terms of having complete runs of corporate records, social records, government, like non-current government records around that time, we are one of the premier facilities for that. And you can also go to the CUNA National Historical Park to research the strike. For us, in terms of format type, what you're going to find for strike records is quite vast. We have corporate records from Calumet and Hecla, the Quincy Mining Company, and the Copper Range Company. We have several dozen historic newspapers on microfilm, and then a few examples in actual print format newspapers in our flat file collection. There's photographs, we have state records and inquests, other serials and biographical files. So if you're interested in, once you learn a little bit from this presentation, or if you're coming to the table with some things that you already know, if you ever find yourself in the Copper Country and you want to do some research, just reach out and we can set you up with an appointment. All right, so the strike itself, we know that it began in the summer of 1913 on July 23rd. And it really was a response to growing labor tensions in the area. There are a lot of grievances that were building up based on the nature of mine work, how dangerous it was, people wanting to organize for safety and for increased wages. And there was some influence coming in from the Western Federation of Miners. It's not that 1913 was the first time that the WFM attempted to make inroads into the Copper Country. They had in fact tried doing some organization to build rank and file in the Copper Country at the early part of the 1900s, especially around 1905, 1906, we're finding evidence of that. But what a lot of folks know is the strike that took place in 1913. But the fact that it had one of the major mining unions coming in at the time, and the fact that it lasted and the events unfolded in the way that it did, it's not just an important part of our Michigan story, our Copper Country story, it's actually also a significant part of national history and the story of labor in the United States. It did indeed make headlines across the country, as I mentioned. You'd found it picked up on the Associated Press. There's a lot of examples of things going out on the wire and being distributed across the country. Within our collections, we have some of the local newspapers. There's examples of the Miners Bulletin, which was a serial that came out from the Western Federation of Miners. There's examples of things coming from Truth, which was a local newspaper. There's things coming from the Daily Mining Gazette. And in fact, there are a lot of ethnic pamphlets and then ephemeral type things. So not necessarily things that were intended to be saved, but flyers, posters, things like that, that were documenting activities that were happening on the ground and also informing how people thought about the strike as it was happening and inform their neighbors, friends, family as things were unfolding. But before we really get into the full events of the strike, I think it's really important to think about the landscape of the early 1900s, putting the strike itself as a movement into a broader context. So as you know, just from your school reader, whatever you learned in US history, this was an era known as the Progressive Era. And it was a time in the United States when folks across the country were really trying to improve the American economic and social landscape. Progressives championed the curtailing of corporate power, enacting child labor laws, and generally just wanting to improve the lives and the working conditions of the poor, the working class, and everyday Americans. Michigan at that time that the strike was unfolding had a progressive governor. Woodridge Ferris campaigned and won the governor's race that year, and it was on such a platform. So he was not unsympathetic to labor. He saw that there was value in having some reform. So while he was advocating for this, he was also very cautious in how he did the advocacy. He didn't want to see a big pendulum shift like when he came in right away. I think he believed in changing things slowly from the inside, you know, working through like campaigning, networking, collaborating with people across the aisle, like trying to build support from within this executive structure. So he wasn't necessarily going to come out and say he was for the strike, but I do believe, and it is documented, that he was sympathetic to labor. At the same time, he did remain a friend to capital, and men like Calumet and Hecla Mining Company's general manager, James McNaughton. So he had to dance this very delicate dance as we're leading into grievances and the concept of strike before it even happened, he had to have been aware that tensions were bubbling up. And how do you steer a state forward effectively when you're trying to appease people with very different viewpoints about how things should move forward in an economic landscape, a social landscape, etc. So keeping that goodwill of labor was certainly a challenge when he was indeed good friends with some of the folks that were very anti-labor at that time. So over dialing back a little bit, outside of Michigan, looking into labor in the early 20th century, just in an American sense across the country. So we're seeing this champion, people advocating for workers' reform and labor reform and reform in American business. But as unions began to organize and improvements came in industry, mine workers formed industrial unions. So we had the United Mine Workers of America, the Industrial Workers of the World, and the Western Federation of Miners. So the first 2 decades of the 20th century, there are a lot of strikes taking place, some of them in fact quite violent, some not with lockouts, but there had been bloodshed at other strikes taking place in other, typically around extraction industries at this time, but in other industry as well. The copper country, of course, was no exception, as copper companies were thinking about ways of growing business, lowering their costs, trying to take some note of what other extraction industries were doing in other parts of the country. They began to tip the scales on some of the ways that they were implementing new change. They wanted to increase revenue and increase production, but at the same time, they wanted to take down the bottom line. They wanted to reduce their expenses overall. So how do you do this? What is the best method forward? And a lot of times that led to tensions because they're very cautious of allowing unions to come in and help organize, because that sort of speaks a little to the opposite of what their goal was, to reduce expense. If people are clamoring for higher wages and they're organizing for higher safety protocols, increased pay, that's not necessarily in the best interest of the company. So a lot of times it gave a little side eye as unions were coming in to try to rally and advocate people to join. And they saw them in some senses as agitators looking to take money from a company rather than seeing the value that a living and a competitive wage could bring to a community overall. So you can see some of this not only playing out in the newspapers, you can see it playing out in letters that were being exchanged between workers and company managers. You can also see this visually on the landscape. I'm not sure how many of you have been to this part of Michigan, but a lot of these structures still remain in some shape or form, but the division of status in the community could absolutely be seen in the landscape and in the built environment. So by 1900, there were more than 50 years of copper production under the belt in the copper country. And I'm talking about industrial copper production. The landscape was a testimony to the power, progress, and prestige of the area mines. The copper country skyline included towering shaft houses, immense smokestacks, and magnificent church steeples on land, often donated by mining companies. And I chose this picture very purposely because it demonstrates that. You can see steeples and magnificent buildings across this landscape. And then you can, as you look maybe to the right side of the frame, you can see very uniform type housing bunched together very closely, not a lot of space between the west wall of one house and the east wall of its neighbor. A lot of these houses really demonstrated the difference between underground mine workers, their families, and then the people that were working in upper mining management and more of the corporate side of the industry. Just to give an example, there's a house in Laurium that has since been turned into a bed and breakfast, but it belonged to a former manager for CNH. And I think it has 9 bedrooms, over 12 fireplaces. And there are over a dozen washrooms, and this is in the early 1900s, and it would just be for that mine manager, his house, and any domestic help that he might have had, you know, between his spouse, his children, and then any inn servants that they had. And we're talking 3, 4, 5,000 square feet in some instances, not to mention a lot of really exotic material culture coming into the home. So imported tiles, handcrafted woodwork, you know, beautiful inlays, like in the way that arches were built, stained glass windows, like you name it, anything that you can think of that would be ornate, fancy, magnificent, you can find it in some of these old historic company homes for former managers up around the Calumet and Laurium area. And that being said, you can also find a lot of the old boarding houses that often had multiple families dwelling within, or sometimes a spouse of a mine worker would run it as a boarding facility, or sometimes just multiple families of the same ethnic group would live together in a community. But sometimes over a dozen people would be living in a 5-room house, not a 5-bedroom house, a 5-room house. So you can definitely see the difference in terms of wealth, prosperity, and distribution of wealth in the way that people not only worked and survived, but the way that they actually lived in that community, the houses, the dwellings that they spent time in. So talking a little bit about more of the labor side, so immigrant workforce was certainly the name of the game in this part of the country in the early 1900s. The Copper Country had a really diverse mix of folks coming in. The most numerous ethnic groups from the genealogy research I've done and also examination of the mining employee cards that we have at Michigan Tech, Croatians, Cornishmen, Finns, Germans, Irishmen, Italians, Poles, and Slovenes. And this is just to name a few. That's not to say that these are the only ethnic groups, but certainly some of the most predominant. In terms of boarding houses and the way that they worked, they often contain dense concentrations of men from the same country. And this was actually sort of a good thing, even though they're stuck and they're working and living in these confined spaces. It was a way to build community, coming all the way from one country to this new foreign land, coming to this place that you've never been. There was a sense of camaraderie and uplift that came from having ethnic groups together, knowing that there was a brother that spoke the same language as you. You could break bread with somebody after being in the mine all day, like having someone to work with. So even though there were some elements that made life very difficult, there were also comforts in the way that people lived by design. So finding that common ground with someone that came from the same place you did was oftentimes a comfort. But it's no surprise that knowing that there was all this diversity, like as the union is coming in trying to organize, there are great challenges to that organization effort just based on this diversity alone. Oftentimes folks are coming over here with very little skill in reading or writing of English. In fact, on some of the Calumet and Hecla Mining and Company employee cards, they would actually know if they could speak English, if they could very well, if they could write English or not. And a lot of times, especially in some of those early waves of immigration, they couldn't speak it or write it at all. So as they're trying to organize, you have to figure out a way to get through that language barrier to make sure that you're not only able to communicate with them, but you're able to communicate in a way that things don't get lost in translation, and that you can figure out how to move forward with an aligned front as you're trying to bring in all these folks from these very diverse backgrounds with different experiences and different language understandings. It certainly was a challenge. So switching away from the labor side, just looking a little bit about the built environment from the community side, mining companies, you know, they build something that has often been referred to as a company town. They provided amenities such as libraries, bathhouses, and houses at reasonable rates to attract and retain workers. These were benefits that were intended to reward good work, instill loyalty, and, you know, kind of diminish complaints. But as long as you worked for the mine, if you lived in company housing, you had to be actively involved in company endeavor, employment. You couldn't just live there if you decided you wanted to find a different or better job elsewhere. So there's sort of this double-edged sword to paternalism. It did help create a lot of the built environment in this part of the region. And there were quite beautiful spaces that were created, but it did come with this sort of quid pro quo that you had to continue to be loyal to the company. So it did create this pecking order in both the workplace and the community. Skilled workers were often given, best privilege of opportunities of where to live, education for their children, and unskilled workers from places such as Finland, Italy, and Eastern Europe often had to live in the most expensive housing, but in the least desirable conditions. So very congested, people packed in, many folks to small room houses, and didn't always have the best access to other amenities outside in the community as well. So with that, I think it kind of sets the stage, like as we understand, sort of what roles and tensions are at play, we can talk a little bit more deeply about the grievances. I chose this photo very specifically because you can't see it very well because of the text, but you get in essence that there's a crowd of folks standing in front of that building, but they're turned to face the camera as the Osceola mine fire blazes in the background in 1895. It's a little odd that day-to-day folks didn't have a photographer, a camera. It's not like today that you could just pull out your iPhone and take a picture. So this was most likely a corporate photographer or somebody that was hired by the mine to snap this photograph. So it's the fact that 30 people lost their lives. Let's not talk about that. Let's talk about the fact that they took a photo, a posed group photo in front of this blaze that's happening. I think to me, like that speaks volumes about the grievances of what was bubbling up under the surface. Mining is dangerous work. To this day, with our technology, it is dangerous work. It always has been, and it always will be, just based on the very essence of what it is. It's dangerous, it's dirty, and it's sometimes deadly. And in this photo, which represents the lost lives of 30 workers, I think we can kind of get a sense of what that danger really was at the late 1800s and turn of the century as these grievances started to grow. So in 1911, 63 men died in copper country mines and many more were severely injured. So that's more than one death per week. We can look to mine inspectors' reports, which we do have in the Michigan Tech archives, that not only speak to the injuries, but also what the witnesses, what cross they had to bear, knowing that their colleague died on their watch or while they were in concert together. There was one instance, I was doing some research with someone that was trying to find a relative, and someone had fallen down a mine shaft, but his colleague heard him yelling but didn't know exactly where he was. So he was going up and down between levels, and it was the lift going back and forth that actually ended up facilitating some of his coworker falling down several flights and dying from a fall. So it was very dangerous, not just to be underground, but the mechanics of being underground, the methodology for doing the work. It created very dangerous situations. And then as technology started to advance, it created more opportunities for grievance. So one thing that you might have heard about is the one-man drill that was instituted. So it was designed to increase production for the mine company, which is good. It creates profit, it generates capital, it allows the mine to keep operating because it's making money. So it's creating jobs, but in the same sense, it's also reducing the number of workers at each drilling site. So rather than it being a team effort to do this very dangerous task, one person was designated to a drilling site to operate this one-man drill. So it opens up opportunities for more accident and injury and hazard to take place. So I think as skilled drill operators started to realize this might be a really negative change, they began to fear not just working alone, but also what was going to happen with their colleague, where would they be relegated to? Would it be a job that they'd be able to do safely? There are a lot of questions that were arising as things started to change, not just in terms of moving forward and growing as a company, but as they're instituting more technological change as well. So these things are starting and continuing to bubble up. So on July 15th, 1913, rank and file locals sent letters to the mine management asking for a settling of grievances and a recognition of the WFM as the official representative of mine workers in the copper country. Mine managers, in fact, ignored that letter. There was actually a follow-up that was sent from some mining firm or mining company affiliates, but still no answer. And this was widespread across the copper country, not just with the majors, but the minor mining firms as well. On July 23rd, 1913, after not getting a response, tensions erupted, as they say, and thousands of underground mine workers went out on strike. Governor Ferris very quickly called in the National Guard, and he wanted to do this in an effort to protect life and property, while strikers held huge parades to talk about and to show support for other striking coworkers, even those from different mines. It really was something that was taking place across the copper country. If you go into the image database that I mentioned earlier, you'll find marvelous photographs of strike parades. And I mean, the way that these pictures are staged in the frame, thousands of people you can see lining the blocks of Calumet, of Hancock, out there in the streets, people hanging outside of windows, waving flags. Like, it really was across the community. And it wasn't just men, it was also women, and it was also children. There were children that held back from going to different community programs and actually organized parades, most likely at the, with some guidance from their parents or from one of the WFM auxiliaries. But there's absolute full involvement of people that were in support of labor. And it didn't matter what age you were, what gender you were. If you were supportive of labor, you were in the streets, or you were helping to create banners, you were helping to maybe do some subversive tactics. I've read some newspaper articles of women actually like dipping mops and brooms into privy buckets and using them to dissuade people from breaking strike lines. And this picture here is actually a photo of a very prominent Michigan woman. You might know her. Her name is Anna Clements, also known as Big Annie. She was born in Calumet, Michigan, to Slovenian immigrants in 1888. And she was very sympathetic to the cause. She helped organize and served as the president of the Women's Auxiliary number 15 of the WFM. And she was actually one of the organizers of the Christmas party that took place at the Italian Hall. I'll not go into so much detail about her because there has been a lot written about her in the secondary literature. There's several good books about her that I know you can find, and certainly you can find information about her biographical sketch online. But I think it's also worth noting that she's sort of stood the test of time. Like, she's transcended this aspect of being this powerful woman that helped lead the strike. She actually became something above and beyond that, to the symbolic, iconic standpoint for what women can do to help support a community cause. And I think for that reason, and in addition to a lot of other reasons, she was inducted into Labor's International Hall of Fame and the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame. And it's not to say that she was the only woman that helped organize. There are other famous labor organizers that came in. Mother Bloor did come to Calumet during this time of the strike. And in fact, her autobiography plays into some of the memory that I'll talk about later on. And then just regular, everyday, woman next door type of women helped organize events for the strike and helped raise the voice of labor's cause during these events. But Annie is most certainly one of the bigger spectacles. So with that, I mean, talking about some of the things that were happening, I think you can't talk about the strike and not talk about what happened at Italian Hall. So I'm sure many of you have heard the story. On Christmas Eve, 1913, the Calumet Women's Auxiliary hosted a party for striking workers and their families. And it was held on the second floor of Italian Hall. So as you look at this image on the slide, you can see the arched doorway on the left side of the building. Once you entered the main door, there was a little vestibule and a second set of doors, and then there's a stairwell that went upstairs to where they held the party. And it had a stage, and it was all set up with Christmas decorations. They had oranges and other treats for the children that were pretty rare when you think about the hardship of a Michigan winter. And the hardship of a Michigan winter and a strike. This Christmas party was a really important part of joy in a time that was really devastating. Like, people were struggling to get by. There was a lot of wondering, like, how are we going to get through the winter? How are things going to turn out? Like, not to mention a strike, like just knowing that things were tight. So I think this party was a really much needed thing at that time. They had songs for the children. There was dancing. There was all sorts of things going on until, unfortunately, someone reportedly shouted fire into the crowded hall, but in fact there was no fire. People rushed to exit. They were streaming to the stairs, and somehow a stairwell stampede started. People were tripping and falling on the stairs, and then the swell was getting blocked because the doors weren't opening. And whether or not the doors opened in or out, it's not for me to say at this time, but there was a clog in the stairwell. Body piled upon body, and the official death count, most official death count, I'll say, was 73 people passed. Almost 60 of them were children. The event immediately became national news, going out on the wire. And I say also immediately confusion about what happened, how and why so many people died on such a joyous occasion. It's something that is still debated in this community to this day, even 100+ years later. And I think that is something that will inform the latter part as I talk more about the memory of the strike. But I don't want to show you too much, but I do have to share these images just for the memory of those that were lost. And these can be a little graphic because the next slide after this does have some photos of children laid up in a makeshift morgue. So if you'd prefer not to see that, that's all right. Maybe just look away from the camera for the next couple minutes. But here's an interior shot when after the aftermath, so going up into the hall after, you can see chairs toppled over. There was clearly a panic. There was a commotion. What was once a joyous party, and here's just a scene of the somber aftermath. And here's a scene that took place. Bodies were carried out of the stampede, and there were so many of them, they didn't have a morgue to bring them to, so they had to create a makeshift morgue in buildings throughout the city. I believe this one was in the Calumet Theater area, but someone please correct me if I'm wrong. That one didn't have a label on it in the archive. And then there were so many lives that were lost. They had a massive community funeral to mourn the loss. And as you can see, it's pretty packed to the brim in terms of folks coming up to rally behind this big tragedy and support the families that lost somebody. And here's a funeral procession leading them. So I'm not sure if anyone has been to Calumet, but from where the Italian Hall dead were buried, from where Italian Hall was in the snow, it's quite a hike. So the fact that looks like the whole town is basically coming out to help get the folks buried and get final respects paid. And here's a scene from the burial. So in the immediate aftermath of Italian Hall, it sort of was the turning point of the morale in the strike. I think those that lost family members were all but broken. I mean, to lose a child, to lose a parent, to lose a brother, sister, mother, what have you, in such a tragic way. But especially for the community at large, to lose so many children, it truly broke a lot of people spiritually. The motivation to move forward, to fight for a cause seemed to be lost at this point. I mean, what more can you fight for when the people that you're fighting for are no longer with you? It's really tragic, and I think you see just in the way that things were being expressed in the newspaper, like the historical record that's left behind, like you get a sense of like been a sea change after this event happened. So immediately, I would say that the strike took on a darker character. Citizens Alliance, which was a group that was very anti-labor in the community, and in fact, some of the published literature does claim that the person that yelled fire had a Citizens Alliance button on. You know, we can't verify this truth. I mean, we're seeking this noble dream of historic truth, but we just don't know that for sure. But what we do know from what was documented in the newspapers and other official letters, Citizens Alliance members did forcibly remove the Western Federation of Miners president, Charles Moyer, from the community. He had been staying at a hotel in Hancock, and they put him on a train to Chicago. There's some rather colorful stories of how that happened. Some involved the fact that there were guns shot. Some included the fact that Moyer got shot. I don't know for sure what happened, but we do know that he got put on a train down to Chicago. The union, the local rank and file, they did attempt to continue, and they wanted to rescue the strike. They did get a congressional investigation on the conditions in the copper country. But it seemed like it was too little too late at this point. The companies were not recognizing the union. They widely implemented the one-man drill. There were some concessions made, some changes in wages for some types of workers. There were some changes in hours for some types of workers and some working conditions. But overall, social historians argue that these were inevitable progressive era reforms, something that would have happened anyway if the strike happened or not. So I think that's something, perhaps an interesting question for a dissertation sometime. But in terms of the strike being broken, the WFM, they spent a lot of money and a lot of time trying to rally around the copper country, and the outcome just wasn't what they wanted it to be. This, along with some other strikes that were taking place in Colorado and some that had equally tragic ends take place, they really wanted to distance themselves from such tragedy. They wanted to move forward with a more positive outlook, so they disbanded and renamed as the International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers. Perhaps this can be seen as an inclusive change to take up not only copper workers and other extraction workers, but ancillary industries as well. But I do think it was also a saving face gesture to try to separate themselves from some of the strike tragedies that happened in the copper country and in Colorado, particularly at Ludlow. So in terms of the long memory, this is where I spent a lot of my time in terms of research. Like chapter 1 of my thesis, I had to tell the story of the strike. I had to research what the events were, but my bread and butter and the area that I continue to work on in terms of intersections of archives, rhetorical production, and history, and how we remember events of the past, this is where I really focus a lot of my energies as a researcher. So looking at the long memory of the strike, so as mine workers, were some stuck with the mines, but eventually we know that mining declined in the region. Others didn't stick with the mines. They were drawn to manufacturing industries down in Milwaukee, Chicago, Cleveland, downstate Michigan. They were distancing themselves from mining work and finding new opportunities. But the fact that, you know, the way and the mining landscape was changing, the memory of the strike sort of lingered in the region. And, you know, we get into these debates of social amnesia and social remembrance. And I think what we initially see in this few years into initial few decades after the strike, the community wanted the right to forget. There was so much life and love that had been lost. The community overall as a collective and the Copper Country as a collective wanted to move forward, find a way to live a life that they weren't constantly cast under the shadow of what happened at Italian Hall or the failed strike. They wanted the right to forget, but a few decades later, they didn't necessarily have that choice. But in the immediate aftermath, even the way that this was talked about in the newspapers, it led some of the groundwork for how memories were formed about the strike. So the image here is from the Finnish newspaper that was up here, and it very boldly like blames the Citizens Alliance for the deaths at Italian Hall. And in fact, the headline on their paper immediately after the strike, it read that 83 people were murdered. It didn't pull any punches. Like, that is very strong language. And the fact that it was the headline, it shows sort of where their sympathies laid in terms of what happened at Italian Hall. But the Daily Mining Gazette, they chose different language, 80 perish and Christmas Eve tragedy. So, you know, they're setting the stage about like, who do we support? Where are our interests? Like, who's our readership? A lot of this tells a story. And so even in the immediate aftermath, these are the historical products that are being created. We're never going to know exactly what happened because people that lived that experience right there on the scene can't even agree about what they witnessed. They can't agree about what was happening. Even eyewitness accounts, no two are the same when you look at the official inquest. So a lot of this confusion that's happening is what sets the seeds for contentious debates about a big tragedy to perpetuate decades, if not over 100 years later, because folks on the ground in their own bodies, living their own experience, can't even necessarily agree with their neighbor about what happened in those events. So as the community tried to forget and move on from the strike, and they had some success with that. There really wasn't a lot of mention of it in the immediate decades. In fact, one of the books that was written about the strike was by a gentleman that grew up in Calumet, and he remembers that anytime the strike was mentioned, folks would switch into their old dialects. They'd speak in hushed tones. It was something that was almost forbidden to talk about. So it wasn't really until a couple decades later that it became socially acceptable to talk about what happened, not just in the community, but even broadly on a pop culture national stage. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Woody Guthrie. He was a very pro-labor folk singer, and he did indeed write a song called 1913 Massacre. He wrote the song, we believe he wrote the song in 1940 or early 1941, and it was released in or near 1941. He was inspired by Mother Bloor's book, We Are Many, which actually had a strike or a chapter about her involvement at the Michigan strike. So he took her autobiography, was inspired by her words, and then as a songwriter, he created his own interpretation of what happened that night. But the funny thing is with a song, it's something that drills into you, it sticks with you. So a lot of people that only know the strike through Guthrie's song take that song as gospel, like this is 100% the truth about what happened. And that just can't be the case. Like, this is an artist's interpretation of someone's autobiography of an event And she wasn't at the entire strike. Like, she had her experience where she was in some of the parades, and she was working and interacting with rank and file and talking with family members and community members about what was happening, supporting the strike. But she wasn't there for all 9 months of it. And she certainly wasn't there on the evening of Italian Hall. So, you know, the fact that it's a story multiple times removed, and then it's delivered through this vehicle of a pop culture folk song, you have to really be careful about what you choose to accept as truth or lived experience for what was happening during the strike. So I think a deconstruction of his lyrics, that could be a presentation in and of itself, so I'll save you the trouble with that tonight. Another piece of interpretation is this investigation into the doors. So, you know, there has been a lot of debate whether or not the doors opened inward, the doors opened outward. Were they talking about the outer door, like the front double door, or were they talking about an inner door that opened inward or outwardly? You may have recalled, I don't know if you saw the book Death's Door by Steve Leto. There's a very famous picture on the cover of that book that creates this field of vision that allows you to see somewhat into that vestibule, but it is a very murky photograph. So it's really up to the observer, like what you see and how you interpret that picture. And the image that I'm sharing here is from a historical research team from the Kuna National Historical Park and a couple other local historians based on primary source research that was conducted of the space itself, what we could find in evidence, or what they could find in evidence in local newspapers and things. And this is their interpretation of how those doors open. And the thing about those doors, it's really not that far back. Like, in a lot of our lived experiences, the building was cited as needing to be demolished in the early 1980s. There was a local owner that lived in Dollar Bay that couldn't afford the upkeep. But there's actual photograph evidence of the facade that, you know, showed some cracks in the bricks and things, but maybe there wasn't a full reason to have it raised based on a structural issue. Like, there's questions around that. So this leads in, you have to, it begs the question, like, was it torn down just because it was a symbol to this tragedy, or really could it not have been saved? Like, what happened here? But the fact that no one walked in to look at the doors is something that a lot of folks in the community find curious. It's almost as if folks just wanted to believe what they wanted to believe rather than going in and opening a door to peek. Or was it really that tragic that people couldn't bear to know the truth? There's a lot of questions swirling around that. And if you have an opinion about those doors and you walk into a saloon in Calumet on a certain day, or if you walk into a certain place in Calumet on a certain day and you say what you think about the doors, you're going to find out if you're a friend or a foe really quick. So I think the fact that there's still this debate, it's almost like it's reached a mythic quality, despite the fact that people are trying to create evidence to show one thing or another. So with this, I'll end with, I think, one of the most lasting tributes of the actual Italian Hall disaster, as well as the strike itself, and that's the Italian Hall Memorial Park. So this actually is the site that Italian Hall was built upon. When they were demolishing the building, a few items were saved, like some of the chairs from upstairs were saved. Some of the bricks from the building were just moved to like a dump site just outside of town so people could go salvage for those. But the archway was very purposely saved, and it was designated as a memorial park. So once the building was raised and the site was cleaned, they went back and installed the arch as a tribute for us to remember what happened and to help provide interpretation about the strike. So there's a lot of good effort that's been created to try to maintain this space. But there's also been some troubling instances and change over time. So I grew up in Tamarack City, which is roughly 10 minutes from where this park is. We would pass by this memorial all the time when my mom was taking us to the Calumet Waterworks to go swimming when we were kids, or to go like rock picking on one of the other beaches. So we'd often stop in Calumet for lunch or to get some ice cream. So since the late 80s, I've been walking by this site, and since the 90s, I've been walking and visiting this park. And there's been a lot of change in terms of the interpretive signage that's there. And the interpretive signage, like the rhetoric that we choose to talk about the past and purposely place at a memorial site, is going to inform how visitors to that site take away what happened at an event, form an opinion about what happened at that event, and perhaps perpetuate a narrative that may be steering toward truth or steering towards misinformation or misguiding information. The narrative plaques at that site have changed a couple of times. There actually was a Michigan Historic Site Program site it had like one of those big metal placards that you see at various places across the state. And it had language that didn't really mention much about the people that died, except that, oh, X amount of people passed, but there really was no like tribute to the people. It didn't feel like a memorial. It just felt like a quick history about what happened. And then there was mention, it did at one point expressly state that the Italian hall doors opened a certain way. And then that sign has since been changed to a new narrative that doesn't include that mention about the doors specifically. And a new granite stone has actually been installed at the site in the last couple years that does name the victims. Because when I was writing my thesis, that didn't exist. And one of the challenges I saw at that site, how are we supposed to remember people when we don't even know their names? Like, how are we supposed to honor the past when we're not sure like whose memory we're honoring? So I think, they're making strides to really speak to this site as a commemorative collective memory site that we can pay tribute and remember the victims. But I think it's also important to keep that strike context there. So just think about that when you're visiting any site, not just Italian Hall, but any site. Like, think purposely and look meaningfully at what words are being chosen to talk about what happened at a place and what the agenda is of the person that is creating that, or the entity or the government organization. Like, what is their purpose for creating this sign? What is their audience? What are they trying to tell us to think? So there's a lot to be said for that. And I could go into a whole presentation about this too, but we're getting pretty close to the hour here. So I'm gonna go ahead and just leave you with this, because to me, like, this story, not so much about the conflict, even though it was important and it is a nationally important labor story. I think the micro histories, like the stories of the people that perished at Italian Hall, the stories of the people that fought for the benefit of their brother, that fought for the benefit of their fellow worker, those are the stories that I want to spend my time remembering. And I'll leave you with this one. Betty and Abram Nimola actually perished in the Italian Hall, and they left their little orphan for 4 months old to grow up without your parents because of a senseless tragedy. These are the types of community and civic and whatever events that we need to try to prevent by just trying to do our best to be good community members and good neighbors. So just never forget these, if not for anyone, at least for the Nimola family. And with that, we'll close out and we can open it up. Feel free to unmute yourselves and we can do some Q&A. I'm happy to stay on for a little bit to chat with you folks. Thanks so much for coming. Oh, and I did want to point out the link to cchi.mtu.edu. That's the direct link to our photo archive on our website. And we also have a full strike exhibit on our website as well. If anything, take my email down or remember copper@mtu.edu, and I can send you any of these links later if you don't have time to jot them down now. All right, thanks for your time.
Okay, thank you very much, Lindsay. That was a great job. I mean, feel free if you feel comfortable in muting yourself to ask a question. If not, use the chat feature. There was one question in the chat about Annie's life after she left Michigan. Do you know anything about that?
I do think she went down to Chicago, but I don't know a lot about her actually, beyond her early part of her life, her initial marriage, and then some of her advocacy and her labor work. But I do believe that she remarried and went to Chicago. So I think that might be some of like the inner workings, like a story that might have inspired some of Mary Doria Russell's work. But I wish I could speak more to that, but perhaps Mary Doria can in the next event.
Sure. And then the other question in the chat was if Annie's family is a distant relative of the senator from Minnesota, Klobuchar.
Someone had asked me that once in a different program, and I didn't know then, and I've researched it, and I still don't know now. I couldn't confirm it, but I have conducted some research on that, and I don't know for sure. But that's not to say that there couldn't be a family link.
Okay. You've talked about how there's still kind of a residue, like sides are taken when the subject is mentioned about the strike in the Calumet area. Are people still raw about it, I guess?
Yeah, I think so. And I think raw is a really interesting term to use because it's hard to think about it still being a raw subject over 100 years later. But I think, yes, I would describe it that way just based on conversations that I was able to bear witness to during the centennial events, things that have been shared to me in confidence while working at the reference desk at Michigan Tech. People have very strong opinions, and some of it stems from their overall opinion about, if they're pro or anti-labor, if they're like pro-capital. Like, I think, there's some like inner feelings that people have about that, even if they don't have a direct connection to anyone that was at Italian Hall. But then also there's still people that had relatives that died in Italian Hall that live in the local area. So when you try to take away someone's remembrance that has been passed down like through their family about what happened, and maybe you confront them with, and not in a negative sense, like you just show them something different that challenges a deeply held family belief, of course that's going to create a very contentious situation, even if it's done with good intent. Like it might open a wound that we didn't know was there, or we weren't sure like how someone would be impacted. And then I think also there's questions about some of the ways that the strike has been written about. There's some authors that take very strong stances, and not just books that were written in like the 50s, 60s, or 70s, books that were published recently, like re-looking and re-examining this event. It's something that doesn't go away because it was so nationally important, and it has this big spectacle of this disaster happening. So I think the fact that the memory remains in a collective sense creates this opportunity for people to still feel raw, like if they disagree with someone about what happened. Absolutely.
Yeah. Now the photo archive, can that be looked at online?
Yep, that's available online, and it's free to look at. It's also free to use any of those images on there, as long as you retain the watermark and credit us. So let's say you have a newsletter with your local historical society and you find a good picture you want to use, go ahead and copy paste it, share it all over. Just make sure that you somehow like credit the Michigan Tech Archives or thank us, or at the very least, just leave that watermark in the corner of the photo. If you're writing a book about something that you might find a photo about and you need a high resolution image, we can also provide that for a small fee. But the things on the website are totally free. So post them on a blog or Facebook, or share them with your neighbor any way that you want to use it. Please enjoy them.
Now the 1939 strike link, the link www.1939strike.mtu.edu, is that the photo archive?
That's actually an online exhibit. So around the centennial, we created an exhibit that had traveling panels. And then we also created a companion piece on the website. So that will tell the story. It'll be some more interpretation of the strike. Some of the way that I laid out my presentation tonight is based on that, but some of it is my own research from my thesis as well. And I will mention, what's the place down in Dearborn? It's like historic Dearborn, or like, it's like a, do you know what I'm talking about? I can't think of what it's called.
Henry Ford?
Yeah, it's not the Ford. There's, oh geez, I can't remember what it's called right now, but the strike exhibit, the actual physical panels are going to be coming down to your area.
Wow.
Dan, I'll go ahead and send you the link or
Yeah.
the name of the place, just so, and when we have advertising for that, just so you can, you know, post a flyer on your bulletin board.
Definitely, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, because that will be freely open to view, and it'll be down there for a few months next spring.
Lindsay, I live in Dearborn, Michigan. I was just curious, like, are you talking about, you're not talking about Henry Ford Museum or?
No, it's not the Henry Ford. You know what? Let me just, I have the person's contact in my email, and while I have you all here, I'm just gonna see if I can find it. Let me stop sharing my screen just a second. Do you have time to wait? If I don't mind looking real quick. Okay. Let's see here.
You're not talking about Detroit Institute of Arts, are you?
No, it's not Detroit. Let's see here. Yeah, I just have too much in my email right now. I'm not finding it.
Well, go ahead and send it to me when you do find it, and then if all the people attending, I'll make that available if you want. You can.
Yeah, that would be fine, because you have a registration link for folks, right? Like you have their emails that you could send it later.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, let's do that, because it might take me longer than I thought to find it.
Right.
Well, thank you, Lindsay, for the presentation. That was very interesting. Appreciate it.
Sure, you're welcome. Yeah, thanks for coming.
So, okay. Anybody else have a question for Lindsay? Okay. Well, I appreciate it.
I'm sorry, just one more thing. I sent a message. I'd really like to look at all the photos in that archive. Could I get the link like sent to me by email?
Yeah, sure. If you put your email in the chat, I can send you the link directly.
Okay. Yeah, I did earlier. You want me to?
Yeah, I'll send that to you, Lindsay.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Sure, you're welcome.
Okay. Anybody else? All right. wanted to thank you very much, Lindsay, for the program. It was very interesting. You're a great speaker, and you really presented it in a very nice fashion. So we really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you kindly. And Ed, I think I found your email in the chat, so I'll go ahead and email you right after this.
Okay, that's cool.
All right, thanks so much for your time. I hope everyone enjoys your evening, and take care.
Take care.
Yep.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.